Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar in the Improving Restoration Spring 2024 series, a collaboration between University of Minnesota Extension and the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. The theme of this series is climate and restorations, and today's topic will be on seed sourcing. I have a few things to cover from the webinar hosts, and then we will get to our speakers for the day. I'm Carly Wagner with the Minnesota DNR, also on behalf of Bowser, working on the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. We collaborate with experts to evaluate restorations, identify what's working, and share information to improve future restorations in formats such as this webinar series. If you're interested in learning more about ecological restoration, our partners at U of M Extension offer an ecological restoration certificate program. This is a great resource for continued learning, and I would encourage early career professionals as well as seasoned practitioners to check out this resource. During the webinar today, we will have time for Q&A after both speakers have presented. Please use the Q&A feature in the bottom ribbon to ask your questions to make sure we see them and can offer them during the Q&A section. You can use the chat feature if you are having technical difficulties or for more general discussion. After the presentation, please take a moment to fill out the survey that will be shown when you leave the webinar. We'd love to hear from you on what you're getting out of these webinars and what you'd like to hear in the future. And if you're interested in learning more about these presentations after the fact, don't worry, they're going to be recorded and posted on the Restoration Webinar website for you to view at any time. This is the final webinar in the Spring 2024 series. Thank you for joining us, and special thanks to our speakers who shared their expertise. We had a great lineup of speakers from academic, nonprofit, state agencies, and private industry, and we hope you appreciated their diverse perspectives and knowledge. Stay tuned for the Fall 2024 series, and in particular, make sure you take that survey. We'd love to hear from you on what you'd like to see in future webinar series. Now to introduce our speakers for today. Marissa Ahlering is the Science Director for Minnesota and the Dakotas at TNC. Marissa's work with TNC focuses on building resilience in grassland ecosystems, designing prairie restorations, and helping to stop grassland conversion. Today, she will be talking about restoring grasslands with diverse seed mixes for climate adaptation. Dan Hernández is a professor at Carleton, teaching courses on ecology and conservation. He studies the ecosystem impacts of different restoration and management practices and works in restored tallgrass prairies in Minnesota. Today, he'll be talking about restoring grasslands under global climate change. And with that, I will open the floor for Marissa to give our first presentation.
All right, thank you, Carly. I will my screen shared here. Slides up. Okay, so yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. And I want to take a minute at the beginning here to acknowledge my colleagues in this work. So Nina Hill was a science fellow with TNC during this project. Dr. Jill Hamilton, who was formerly of North Dakota State University and now at Penn State, was a collaborator on this project, as well as Jess Lindstrom, who was a master's student at NDSU during the project as well. And so what I want to share with you today is basically the goals and initial outcomes of a project we undertook to help boost the climate adaptation capacity of our grassland reconstructions, basically by diversifying our seed mixes. And so I know I don't need to explain to any of you the need for restoration. That's why you're all here. You know, we're familiar with the landscapes that look like this, right? This happens to be Western Minnesota, near where I live, where we have really isolated, often small fragments of that one vast prairie that's now embedded in row crop agriculture. So what's on this, the yellow on this map is the Minnesota DNR's native prairie layer, and you can see how kind of fragmented that prairie is. And that fragmentation alone challenges our native prairie by reducing population sizes of plants and animals in those prairies and reducing the gene flow necessary for species to adapt to changing conditions. And the rapid pace of the ongoing climate change that we're experiencing currently is just exacerbating this challenge. And so as we put grassland back on the ground, we really need to think about how we do that to make sure that climate adaptation and resilience are really key components of that strategy. Because reconstruction, as we all know, is a very big investment of resources, time, money, a lot of sweat, a lot of sweat equity goes into them. And we want to make sure we set our sites up for success and persistence. So we as scientists and practitioners, right, we recognize the importance of diversity in our seed mixes, and we've recognized this for a long time. This is not a new concept necessarily. But the emphasis has largely been on species diversity, I would say, and that's absolutely critical, right? You need lots of different species to fill all of those functional group niches for a prairie community, and you need redundancy of species in those niches, which basically means like many different species in each of those functional groups, right? And so this in and of itself is an adaptation strategy for resilience. However, one aspect of diversity that I think has been given less consideration over the years is really thinking about that genetic diversity component. You know, and this is likely because you can go out to a prairie and you can say, all right, look, there's 10 different things out here. There's 10 different species. But it's not as easy to quantify or measure genetic diversity observationally, right? You can't just go out to that same prairie and look at a population of coneflower and say, oh yeah, in that field, I know that's a really, high genetic diversity population. You just can't tell that by looking at the plants. But regardless, that component of diversity is really important for successful adaptation, right? And therefore, the long-term resilience we're trying to achieve in our restorations. Because we know that building block of adaptation is that variability, which is created by the genetic diversity. So, how do we consider genetic diversity in our seed mixes if we can't observe it, right? That's a challenge. So there are a number of different strategies or philosophies of thought around genetic diversity and adaptation and seed sourcing. And I'm going to kind of go through three here at the beginning of the talk and then talk about the one we really focused on in our project. But one of the more widely used and recommended strategies with seed sourcing, right, is that of sourcing your seed locally. This strategy I would say, is not really focused on genetic diversity per se, but it emphasizes the role of local adaptation in the success of those prairie plant communities. And basically is assuming that genetic diversity will be sufficient locally to support adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. And we know local adaptation is a real phenomenon. And this is just an example of a meta-analysis looking at reciprocal transplants, which provides evidence of local adaptation in many cases. But a few years back, I was really interested in how common local adaptation this idea is used to guide seed sourcing policies for practitioners, because I know we use it a lot around here. And I was just curious, it's common in Minnesota. How widespread was this? And so I sent out a survey to restoration practitioners asking about their seed sourcing practices. And when I originally sent this survey out, I was really intending it for practitioners in our region, kind of locally. But as you can see, it kind of got distributed pretty widely and ended up with 494 responses from 40 different states and 5 provinces in Canada, including Nova Scotia, which floored me at the time. So there's people doing prairie restorations all over North America. And there was really a lot of energy around the survey and a lot of very passionate responses. But interestingly, when you asked whether or not, the person being polled had any organizational or governmental or just individual policies around dictating the use of local seed sources for restorations, only 4% of respondents basically said no. We have we get seed from wherever. Basically, 96% of the respondents were guided in some way by a policy to use local seed sources. So I thought this was amazing. And, I thought a number would be high, but I did not really anticipate it to be this high. So the message that plants have local adaptation and sourcing seed locally is a good strategy has definitely been received, I think, by the restoration community. Maybe not surprising to all of you, but I didn't know it was this widespread. However, the details matter, right? And when we asked them about how they define local, the answers were kind of all over the map. And so this is maybe also not surprising, but it was interesting to see kind of how much the spread was. So there were certainly some on the end of the spectrum that were going less than 10 kilometers from their restoration site, while others were calling seed from 400 kilometers away, kind of local, as in like, I suppose it's in the same ecoregion. So that definition of what was local has a lot of variability, but the majority were somewhere in between, right? But it's definitely not as consistent as you might have hoped if local adaptation is kind of truly the goal in that strategy. And so, while we have evidence that local adaptation is important to prairie plant communities, we also have evidence that there's a lot of variability in species and traits in terms of the strength of that local adaptation. And additionally, with the isolation of plant communities for many decades and our rapidly changing climate conditions, there are some very real concerns about whether or not the current local adaptations and levels of genetic diversity might be enough to sustain populations into the future. So if we are considering how to source seeds for new reconstructions, we may need to think beyond local adaptation. Although, thinking about the diversity of what local adaptation means, maybe not. So another option that has been proposed for thinking about, seed sourcing is climate matching. And this is where we think about sourcing seed from locations that are currently experiencing the type of climate that is projected to occur at a reconstruction site sometime in the future. So these tend to be generally areas that are much farther south. And this is a figure showing some models that were done for Minnesota that show current and projected climate envelopes for different regions of the state. And so a climate matching strategy builds on this concept of local adaptation, right? In that it's assuming that populations at the more southern sites are locally adapted to that current climatic factors, and that sourcing seed from these populations will then confer those advantages to the populations establishing in their new reconstruction. And this may be true, but one challenge here is that plants are also likely to be adapted to other types of conditions beyond just climate, right? Such as the physical environment, like soil type and texture, in addition to other factors. And additionally, if they are adapted to more southern climates that don't, quite exist up here yet, they may not establish well either at the beginning. And so this is an intriguing strategy, I think, and but it may have some challenges for implementation. I don't honestly really know how widely it's been tested yet, so I'd be curious to hear if people have tried it. The last strategy I will mention here is the one that we were focused on in this project, and that's often called regional admixture in the literature. And so this is kind of to make sure that we have genetic diversity in our seed mixes necessary for adaptation. We say that it's increasingly recommended in the literature. We've seen that we mix our seed from multiple sources for all the species in that mix. And so the assumption here is that more populations equals more genetic diversity. And so regional admixture is seen as kind of a balance. I kind of think of it as a yes and approach. Yes, local adaptation, and we need to think about genetic diversity. Between these potential limitations of, local only seed sources and the potential maladaptations that people worry about for moving seed from greater distances away. And so, yes, local adaptation is important, and we need to think about, making sure we're getting enough genetic diversity into our seed mixes. So this practice, I think, is getting a lot more adoption. Certainly, we are using it more in the Nature Conservancy in our restorations as we go about our work. And the goal of this project was really to implement some of that, genetically diverse reconstructions and to set ourselves up to evaluate some of that success. So we had 4 main project goals. The first was to develop resources to help land managers actually implement multiple source seed mixes, because, identifying it as one, finding the sources to get multiple sources is another. Basically to implement those restorations and then to evaluate effectiveness. And then finally to share out some of our learning and tools. So we, in our first year, developed those resources. We basically needed to find lots of seed sources. And so we sent a big crew of people out into the field with tablets to go out, set them into the prairie and map locations of seeds that we could potentially collect from a lot of different species and a lot of different sources. And these mapping efforts resulted in the development of a database to basically track locations of seed sources for many different prairie plants common to our prairie reconstructions. And to date, we have, this is a map kind of showing where we're at. We have over 34,000 mapped populations, 176 different sites from public lands and conservation lands, TNC lands, and other ownerships as well. And these tools are housed in a ArcGIS Online as well, which I'll share about a little at the end. And we now have over 308 species represented in this database as well. This table is just showing our top 10 with the most populations recorded. And you can see these are not rare species for the large part. These are pretty common species going into our restorations, but just wanting to have multiple locations for these species of large populations that we could potentially collect from to include in our restorations going forward. So from this initial mapping of multiple populations and many different species, we implemented basically over 900 acres of prairie reconstruction at 8 different sites. And this map kind of shows you where those reconstructions happened, making sure that we had high species and high genetic diversity in those mixes. And so the red dots here are the locations of those restorations. And then on the evaluation front, we're making a lot of progress as well, but given that restoration is a long-term endeavor, some of our results are going to be a couple years down the road. And actually, this year we're hoping to go back, be the year to go back and resample some of these. But we were able to work with NDSU in this project and kind of support a graduate student to advance the science using our project and our data. And so Jess Lindstrom helped us establish some experimental plots to look at the impacts of multiple populations in seed mixes on restoration success. And so we set up these experimental plots at 2 different locations, one in western Minnesota, one out in South Dakota. And we had 20 plots to compare plots that are planted with a single seed source. So that's the solid colors here. Each of these had a mix of 14 species, but each species was only one population in each of these sort of 3 plots. And then we had a set of plots where we had all 5 of those sources for each species mixed together in these 5 replicates that basically had mixed seed source populations. So just to share with you a little bit of our preliminary data. So this is data that was taken the year of seeding and the year after, which, as you can imagine, year 1 communities were dominated by non-seeded weedy species. But we were still interested in whether there were any community differences among treatments in terms of what was germinating and what was establishing. So in Minnesota, you can see here that we had, this is the year, so 2020 is the year they were seeded, 2021 is the first growing season after that, and the light gray are the number of seeded species, which as you can see is a very small amount, whereas the dark gray is the number of non-seeded species, which is much higher. But you can see that in our Minnesota site, that the multi-bar here on the right, did see a couple more species kind of popping up, and that increased even a little bit in 2021. And as I said, we're planning to go back this year and kind of resample these plots and see where they landed as well after a few years of management and letting them kind of get established. Our site in South Dakota, we didn't quite see that trend with the multiple species population mix sites on the end here, but you can kind of see it was pretty consistent across all of the different seed treatments in terms of what was this number of seeded species establishing. So hope to have more data to share maybe next year in terms of where we've landed with some of these small plots and what we're learning about, what multiple seed sources can do potentially for our restorations. But the last piece in terms of learning and tools, as we built this database to complete the project, we really became aware of how useful it might be for helping our land managers to identify where to get multiple seed sources for species that they want to include in their mixes. So Nina Hill, my colleague on the project at the time, built a web app on ArcGIS Online that can create kind of reports for managers based on some simple queries to say our restoration site is here. I want populations, of this species within so many miles of the restoration sites, just to kind of get an idea of if you're trying to do some of your own seed sourcing or have the ability to do that, where you could find some of those populations. And this data is shareable. Potentially, we've got the databases kind of being reconfigured at the moment, but if people are interested in that, I'm happy to kind of talk about that later and share some of that information. So with this last slide here, I'll just say I want to thank our funding sources. The Prairie Pothole Joint Venture really kicked this off with our funding, but then a large portion of the funding came from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. Also funds from using kind of matching restoration work done with the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, and also North Dakota State University in helping us kind of do some of the evaluation. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Marissa. Please be sure to put your questions for Marissa in the Q&A feature. And Dan, go ahead, take it away.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Marissa, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks, Marissa. My name is Dan Hernández. I'm a professor at Carleton College. I'm going to talk a little bit about this climate matching approach to doing seed sourcing and talk about some of the challenges that come up when you try and adopt this climate matching approach. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging where the field of restoration really started and what the goals have been for a long time. People like this guy and the work that he did have really shaped the way we think about restoration. This guy and people like him made maps like this that showed the vegetation at the time of European colonization of North America and in places like Minnesota. And these maps have had a big influence on the way that we think about restoration priorities. They determine at my local site where we decide woods ought to be and where prairie ought to be, where the floodplain forest stops and starts, based on these land surveys that were done in the 1850s. However, as Marissa pointed out, things have changed a lot since the 1850s. And this is another figure from that same paper from Sue Gladowich and others that pointed out the changes that are coming very soon to Minnesota, changes in precipitation and changes in temperature that are making Minnesota projected to be warmer and drier than it's been in the past. If we look at where I work at the Carleton Arboretum, the climate that we currently are experiencing is 250 kilometers south in terms of the historic climate today compared to what it was. So what that means is that that climate shift of 250 kilometers has happened, but the populations of plants that exist in these places haven't been able to track that. By 2070, projections are that the climate of Northfield, Minnesota will be more like southern Iowa or even eastern Nebraska. The changes in climate are nothing new on plant communities in North America. And these changes in climate have had impacts on the composition of plant communities. These are figures made from data from Margaret Davis that showed the movement of species in response to the receding of glaciers over the last 20,000 years. So species do and can move in response to climate change. But Margaret Davis and Ruth Shaw noted in 2001 that our current pace of climate change meant that implausibly higher migration rates would be necessary for plant populations to match climate shifts in the future. This was 2001, and now we're at 2024, and this problem is, if anything, only worse than it was, or more apparent than it was in 2001. And so given all of this, the question, and also these implausibly fast migration rates are taking place for tallgrass prairie species under this sort of landscape. This is showing the historic extent of tallgrass prairie in light green, and in dark green, the current extent of tallgrass prairie remaining. And so species need to move faster than they've ever moved before, and they need to move through a landscape that mostly is made up of habitat that isn't suitable for them. And so given these realities, the question is, what do we do, right? What should the management goal be for future prairies? Should we, as we've done in the past, think about restoration goals of using local species and genotypes and historic assemblages and management approaches? Or should we accept the inevitability of these changes and think about using climate appropriate species and genotypes and novel assemblages and even novel management approaches that might help us achieve our restoration goals. This idea is called climate adjusted provenancing, and Prober et al. In 2015 wrote a really nice paper explaining what this would look like. In this example, the star is the site of restoration, and the green is that local seed sourcing or local provenancing. The direction of expected climate change is really ignored in the seed sourcing in this example. Climate adjusted provenancing instead looks like this, where the star is again the restoration site, and some seed is collected locally, but seed is also collected in the direction of expected climate change so that there is greater genetic diversity, especially of genes that might be best suited to current and future conditions. This approach is not necessarily universally accepted in terms of thinking about it as a conservation or as a restoration approach. And this is an older paper that very bluntly pointed out that assisted colonization may be a risky or even completely non-viable conservation strategy. And there's been a lot of arguments against this idea of assisted migration. There are folks who have said that doing this ignores biotic interactions, brings species outside of those interactions that might influence their populations. That it requires information on species' functional role to predict the species' impact in the community. That it could result in novel species assemblages that have no historic analog, and possibly even extirpation of native species. I would argue, and my colleague who I've worked with on this, Mark McCone, would also argue that this is what we do in restorations already. When we do restorations, especially prairie restorations, we tend to take a site that has been in agriculture for a long period of time, that has really altered soils, and we throw some species in, really ignoring the biotic interactions that might exist. We see unrealistic, if you compare them to remnant prairies, unrealistic abundances of some species, and we see absences of others. We don't bring along key species that interact with these plant species that we bring in. We ignore bringing fungi or birds or insects into these restorations. And we also bring them in under the conditions of having an overabundance of some species. In our case, white-tailed deer, which are far more abundant than they were historically in tallgrass prairie. And so I would just argue, and I've been involved in a lot of work to look at how these restored sites differ and what the impacts of that difference, what those differences are. And I would argue that we're doing this already. We're ignoring a lot of the things, or we're taking a lot of these risks in our current restorations. And so to me, they don't make a very strong argument for why we should not think about doing climate adjusted provenancing. So what is the future of restoration? If you Google the future, this is one of the images that comes up. So I think it looks pretty great, adding some extra planets and moons and such. But the future of restoration is a bit of a question right now. I think that it's something that we haven't really done extensive work to think about what these different approaches might look like and what the outcomes might be. But this is a question that I worked on in a recent paper with my colleague, Mark McCone. Mark has been a professor at Carleton College for many years, and he was really involved in the restoration efforts of the current prairies that exist at Carleton. There was virtually no prairie in the mid-90s, and Mark made a plan for how to do prairie restoration on some of the agricultural land that was owned and managed by Carleton. This site, the Carleton Kaolin Arboretum, is on the homelands of the Wapakute and Mdewakanton bands of the Dakota Nation. And the vegetation that exists at this site is trying to be reflective of the historic compositions based on those surveys that happened in the mid to late 1800s. The current vegetation of the ARB looks like this. So I've zoomed in on the biggest patch of prairie that we have in the lower arboretum. And the map there shows the last 2 years of the year in which that plot was restored. So starting in 1995 and going through 2008, there's a big contiguous block of prairie. That prairie was planted from all local, locally sourced species, native prairie remnants, including McKnight prairie, including roadside and railroad side prairies, other little prairie remnants in the area. And it was, they were collected from a pretty tight radius. So I think it was a 20-mile radius where all of the seeds were collected for all of these restorations. But as Mark and I have been talking over the last few years, he has really started to question this approach and to think about whether climate change might require an adjustment to the approach that we've taken. And so he and I just went through the exercise of thinking through, like, what would this look like? What would we do if we wanted to do this climate adjusted provenancing? And so what we did is we thought about how we would decide what species we might bring in if we were going to bring species that weren't currently in our prairies. So we looked at all of the plant species in Iowa using the Biota of North America website. And we considered all the potential prairie plant species and then excluded those that weren't really good fits for various reasons. Woody species, exotic species, hybrids, things like that. Those that were rare in their source range that we probably weren't going to get seed for anyway. Habitat generalists. But we came up with a list of 26 species that we would select for assisted migration. 26 species that would be in addition to the 80 or so species that we normally source locally. So a pretty big % increase in species richness. We chose species that don't currently exist at our site, but they do exist in the area that is representative of the current climate of Northfield. So we chose the southernmost 2 counties of Minnesota and the northernmost 4 tiers of counties in Iowa. And we look for species whose ranges fall in that area, but don't exist where we are. And so here's just a few examples. This is Silphium integrifolium. We have a Silphium species in the ARB, but we don't have integrifolium. This is a great candidate. It's pretty widespread in the area that we're focused on, but it doesn't exist in Minnesota. Echinacea pallida is another example where its current distribution sort of stops right at the Minnesota-Iowa border. It doesn't yet exist in Minnesota, but could potentially exist given the current climate. So we imagine that our provenancing would look something like this, right? We would try and get most of our seed for these species from the area in red that represents the current climate, represents the historic populations that are experiencing the climate that currently exists in Northfield. And it includes this list of species here. We've listed the number of counties where that species exists and a mean coefficient of conservatism value to try and prioritize certain species that we might consider for this project. But in addition to bringing in these species, we also imagine bringing in all other species that we might put into the restoration in a pattern that exists in these yellow circles. So we would do local provenancing of the species that currently exist locally, but we would look for those local species in the areas in red and even beyond to try and maximize the genetic diversity of the entire community. So in this paper, what we called this idea was community level assisted migration. Don't just bring the ones that are new, but bring genetic diversity of all species and move the entire community in response to climate change. So our plan is that a community level assisted migration would include any species that could exist under climate change if there were a continuous landscape of prairie habitat. In some ways, we're trying to restore the process of migration and allow for these species to track climate change in the way that they did historically. We would also include sufficient genetic variation to allow species to adapt to a changing climate. And as Marissa said, there may be more than climate change that's driving the success of any particular species. And having as much variation as we can might allow us to see greater success in the establishment of these populations. But since we wrote that paper, we have moved forward in trying to do this, trying to do an experiment that actually tests this idea. The plan is to do a new restoration that includes strips of what we're calling a 2050 prairie, alongside strips of what we're calling an 1850 prairie, ones that don't involve that process of assisted migration. And then doing it with experimental replicates so that we can test the impacts and look at differences over time. However, as we've started to do this, we've run into some challenges, and some of these have been brought by various folks who have commented on our plan and from the land managers at the site where we're working. So first, there's concerns regarding the genetic pollution, and that's my word, of the existing populations. So if we're bringing genes from southern populations of existing species, we are adding new genes into this existing population, and those genes might spread through. I think that might actually does mean that the unique genetic diversity of this site would be potentially compromised. Second, it's unclear, and we're still in conversations about this, but it's unclear about the rules in establishing new populations of state-threatened species. So many of the species that we are considering for assisted migration are threatened in the state of Minnesota, and that makes sense because their populations are mostly restricted to Iowa. And whether or not we need permits to establish populations, what happens to those populations if they spread out of our research area, and what happens at the end of the experiment, even if it's a long-term experiment, what happens at the end, and what are we obligated to do with those species, with those populations after the experiment. Those are open questions and something that we're going to have to consider. So given those concerns, we've really kind of walked back a little bit of what we plan to do in order to address some of the concerns that exist from our own land managers and from other folks. So first, we're planning to do this project way up here, where this blue circle is, across the river, and with a forest in between our current restored prairies and this planting. This is currently in agriculture. It's a site that was planned for future prairie. It's isolated and maybe easiest to track if there's any spread and take care of it if we have any issues with that. We plan to establish a planting with the new species because they're easy to track where they are and where they aren't, but not use southern genotypes of existing species because of this big concern about bringing in these new genes into existing populations. Like I said, we'll isolate the new planting from existing restorations and then develop a monitoring plan for risks of invasion or thresholds of species abundances that might cause for some particular concern. So developing these plans is still ongoing. We're hoping that we can plant this prairie in the fall. And so this is a time when we're trying to have as many conversations like this as possible and get people's thoughts and opinions on this approach. And that is it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marissa and Dan, for your presentations. So please, everyone in the audience, please continue to put questions into the Q&A, and we'll try to address as many questions as we can. So just starting off.
Wait, Julia.
Yes. Oh, yes. We were going to have a little poll.
Yeah. So, so Dan and I were curious. Well, thank you, Dan, for that. And I should have queued you up with the climate matching during my presentation. It was not like connecting the dots. But very cool stuff. And so Dan and I are curious. We have a little poll for you all that Chelsea, if you want to launch it. There are all these different methods of seed sourcing strategies, and we're just curious which ones you all have tried and to see like what people are doing. So if you have a minute to take the poll. And I'm not allowed to vote. Okay. I don't know, Chelsea, if you can see like live.
Lots of responses coming in.
Okay.
Yep, and panelists aren't able to participate in the polls. Just let me know when you want me to launch. We have 67 responses so far.
Yeah, I don't know. Will it live update as if you share the?
I think it just ends completely.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll give people 10 more seconds to choose your responses.
All right, looks like it's slowed down.
Cool. Very cool.
Nice even distribution there.
Yeah. Yeah, mixing regionally, some climate matching, some system migration. Yeah, well, very cool. I would love to, yeah, I'm excited to hear questions and I'd love to hear from some of you all too about the work you do.
One comment I would have on the poll itself, just the way it was written, and you can both respond to this, but do you really consider local only to be, you know, out to about 10 to 20 miles? Because it seems like historically there's been some guidance that, you know, for different species, it should be different. Like it could be for some grass species that are wind pollinated, it could be 250 miles or 150 miles or something like that. Could you kind of address that, why those parameters were chosen? And
I just was trying to create categories. I think personally, local adaptation, like what is local, is a very difficult thing to define and is probably different for every single species. So in this case, I was just trying to say like something really close, and maybe I shouldn't have used local adaptation. Maybe I should have said really close to the restoration site. But yeah, so maybe I didn't word it very well, but I was just trying to create sort of variability in the categories for the poll. Yeah.
Dan, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know the original justification for why they picked that limit in the prairie restorations that started in the 90s at Carleton. There were probably enough little patches around that was a limit that made sense for feasibility. But I'm not sure what drove that particular limit.
And this kind of leads to the next question I'd like to have you address, and I'll have you both touch on it. You know, you're both in kind of professional roles doing this, but there are a lot of practitioners who might have their bachelor's degree or something. Some of them might even have a degree in wildlife instead of anything related to restoration. But they might be thrown into the position where they have to design a restoration and, you know, source the seed for it. How do people like that determine whether, you know, these professionals without high levels of knowledge about the genetics and things like that determine how, you know, what strategy they should use in what kind of a site, where they should source seeds from, et cetera? What guidance would be available for somebody like that to use? I'll let Marissa, you can address that first if you like.
Sure. So that's a good question. And the first thing I would say is you first have to decide, like, why are you doing the restoration? Like, what's the goal of this? Are you trying to restore it for particular wildlife species? Is it connectivity? Is it in this case mostly because of erosion? Like, you know, depending on what the goal is for why you're doing the restoration can help you sort of point you towards what types of guidance you might want to look at. But then I would say there is a lot of guidance documents out there, especially in Minnesota around, and also in Iowa, like the Tallgrass Prairie Center out of Iowa has a lot of resources around seeding rates, species, what they're good for. Minnesota Department of Natural Resources also has a lot of resources. Bowser has some resources on seed mixes and seed sources. So there's a lot out there. And once you kind of figure out your objectives, I would use those like as keywords to kind of search for some of those resources through agencies or other local resources. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And Dan, can you address that? And then on top of that, can you, since you mentioned tribal, tribal lands, can you let us know if there's been any tribal input and what their feelings might be on assisted migration?
Yeah. So for the first question, one thing that we tried to do is come up with an approach to choosing species that might be candidates for assisted migration in a way that anybody could do. And so the Biota of North America website is just a website. You can click, genus by genus, look at the species maps and look at which ones exist in the climate that you want to try and have represented in your restoration. So it's a little it's a lot of clicking, but it's not a huge amount of work to figure out which ones might be good candidates. I'll say there was a question in the chat about like how do you decide which are prairie species and the C value of like prairie specialists. We decided on an arbitrary cutoff of 4 for being the cutoff for what counts as a prairie specialist. And then we used the C values that were published for 6 different states and used an average of that to try and get a representative one. So that's on that. In terms of getting input from Indigenous communities on this particular project, we don't have that input yet. We haven't asked. It's something that I hope that we can do before we start this project and see if there's any input. This isn't a justification for not doing it, but we've also never asked what species of assemblages ought to be there in the restorations that we've done previously. But I do think that moving species is a bigger question and one that ought to at least be considered by as broad of a representation of constituents as possible.
And I'm going to stick with you, Dan, here. And maybe you'll both have some thoughts on this, but before we, move these things from Iowa, for example, to Carleton College, if the genetics at Carleton College are currently the local genetics, there's a concern that maybe we wouldn't be able to, at some point, identify the local genetic populations anymore if we want to move those to a point further north. And so how would you address that kind of little conundrum?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think doing this project is it's an experiment to test an idea, and it is not expected at this point to be the widespread adopted in any restoration that might happen in the area. And so the prairies that are for some species, some mixing might happen, but for prairies that are 10, 20, 50 miles away, the likelihood that bringing these species here would then somehow influence the genetics of those would be pretty minimal. So this doesn't impact that the local genetics on a regional or 50-mile, 100-mile level, but it could potentially impact them more locally. There was this question there's another question in the chat about where are we going to get species from if we're not now going to use these species from the South for those that already exist locally. And for that, this is part of the compromise in getting this project established, is that we'll just use local seed in the way that we have previously. So it'll be adding in as many of those 26 species as we can into our existing community. And that existing community will be, locally sourced so as not to cause any change in the genetic diversity of the population from movement from the south.
Are either of you aware of any seed banking efforts, you know, specifically associated with preserving the genetics of a particular provenance population?
I think the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is actually got a project ongoing right now to collect seed for basically to store and preserve seed of species. But you'd have to check on that. I'm not 100% sure.
So you're not aware of the scale of that effort at this point?
Well, I think it's happening a fair bit across Minnesota, but and I do think there may be, you mean in terms of like North America as a whole?
Yeah, broadly. I mean, if we're going to be using assisted migration, and we would think it might be important to know the genetics of a particular population, the historics of that. So now we have a map of where, you know, prairies used to be and where they currently are, but we don't have a map of where the genetics are or where they used to be.
Well, I mean, that's where herbarium specimens can come in handy, is like doing sampling from herbarium specimens, because you can get DNA from them. But also I think USDA has some seed, is it USDA or is it, well, that's USDA, it's not say Forest Service, but there are some seed repositories nationally across the US that include not just like crop seeds, but many of our native species too, because I know that researchers can sometimes request use of those seeds. But I don't know the extent to which they're like kept current, or, you know, the protocols around what's included there and what isn't. But I know there's like that effort, and I know there's I've heard of a few other like kind of regional efforts. Maybe there's a larger national effort. I'm not sure, Dan, if you know of anything.
I don't, and I'll just say, you know, this isn't something that we do right now. We go out and we collect seed from different populations, and we don't pay any attention to the genetic diversity that we might be introducing. And those species might be really unusual, right? There may be something about that spot that makes their genetics really unusual, really uniquely suited to that particular place. And we don't think about whether they're suited to our place, right? They're certainly, these species are certainly not suited to a soil that's been in agriculture for a century. They're not suited to nitrogen levels like that. They're not suited to a depleted microbial community. And we just toss them all in, and we just imagine that however you define it, 20 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles, that's good, right? But 250 kilometers, right? That's too far. That's not, then we need to take some special consideration of their genetics. And I would just argue we've never done that. And it has often we've met restoration goals, or we've sometimes seen issues like overabundance of the dominant C4 grasses, and we've said, well, it's probably because the soil microbes are different, or it's probably because the nutrient levels are different. But it's really, really hard to, even if we knew what the genetic diversity was, it's really hard to know what the right genetic diversity is, or whether we would exclude or include based on that information.
Well, and I would add to that it's like genetics are something that's constantly changing in place too. So this is not like preserving a local genotype is it's something that's just a moving target anyway. And as I said at the beginning, you know, like the fragmentation of our prairies is a phenomenon that's, you know, recent, but also like been persisting for decades now. And we have lost, I mean, if you think about how bison used to move seed around, I mean, there's a thesis out of somebody, a master's thesis out of, I think it's a master's thesis out of Kansas, who basically like took the fur of a bison and counted the number of seeds that and different, you know, found in that fur. And if you think about it, like they grew it in the fall, they walked around and collected the seed, they moved somewhere else, and then they shedded all that seed in their fur somewhere else. And none of that gene flow happens anymore. And granted, that's particular species that are adapted to, like, you know, stick into fur or whatever, but that's a number of species, and none of that gene flow is happening anymore. And that's not just 10 miles or 20 miles or maybe even 50 miles. So
another question I'm going to throw at you both. So thinking about this scaling up, if we are going to do assisted migration, how do we get, I was going to point out, Dan, too, we don't necessarily know the genetics, but a little bit of a proxy to that is the yellow tag sourcing. That is a regulation in Minnesota where the native seed vendors are yellow tagging, and so we know the source of their seed generically. So my question then is, how do we get the local vendors on board, and how would they start to roll out a program like assisted migration? Can you envision how that might happen? And Marissa, I'll let you go first since you're on the screen here.
Oh gosh, how would vendors roll out a
I
program?
mean, right now you both have done your own seed collection in-house, it sounds like. But you know, if this was going to happen on a larger scale on, you know, multiple types of restorations, different agencies, private restorations, and
well, I guess the thing that comes to my mind is that I'm not sure the vendors need to roll out the assisted migration so much as like if they're tagging their seed from where it came from, where it was sourced, where it was grown, then I think it's like the practitioners who need to be making the decisions about, you know, which seed are they going to want to include, which species, from where, how are they making those decisions based on their site and their context and whatever they're trying to achieve at that site. So I guess I don't know. I don't necessarily see it as a vendor.
so possibly the person doing the restoration is going to just source from different vendors from some, you know, continuum.
Yeah, I mean, with vendor seed, it gets complicated because it's like, well, maybe the seed came from further south, but then it was grown here. So what is that? That changes the, you know, so it gets complicated quick. And so as long as I think the vendors are being, you know, transparent about like where the seed came from, where it was grown, and then people implementing restorations are just going to have to take that information and make the decisions for themselves. I don't know, Dan, what your thoughts on that would be?
Yeah, I agree. I think that this gets to one of the other questions that I saw in the chat, which is about like where do where you get your seeds from may really depend on the climate projections. And it's true. The area that we're considering seed sourcing is really based on those well, in part on climate projections. We actually tried to focus on where climate change has already moved. And so we already have the historic climate of Des Moines, Iowa. And so anything that's collected or grown in northern Iowa is the current climate of Northfield, Minnesota, not projected climate. But to go beyond that, once you go beyond that, I think that sourcing could spread more broadly, and it could include seed sourcing from areas that are within the projected climate and a little beyond in different directions. The cost is in the seed, but the cost in the restoration success, like if there's a failure, that's okay, right? A seed that doesn't make it is okay. And so having diversity means you increase the chances of success.
I think we have time for maybe one more, if we can make it kind of quick. We have just a couple minutes. So the question regarding just like kind of reinforcing what the regional admixture strategy is, and then adding on to that the concept of how does it incorporate both local source and climate matching? So either of you want to take a stab at that? Are those kind of incorporated into it together in a way?
I would say regional admixture is not really necessarily incorporating climate matching. I think it's acknowledging local adaptation, but the need for genetic diversity. And so increasing the number of sources, make it with the assumption that different populations are going to have different genetic diversity, so that you're improving the genetic diversity of the site, but you're not necessarily focused on just south or some particular climate matching in that strategy.
I agree. It seems like the regional admixture versus climate adjusted is really just directional. Directional regional admixture is climate adjusted provenancing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think the fact that, I mean, Northfield, you're saying, oh, well, it's coming from Iowa, but you're not that far from Iowa. So like really in the end, and when you're matching like current climate and not even like some theoretical future climate. So, you know, risks are pretty low in terms of maladaptation in those cases too. So it's just sort of specifically directional and focused.
Great, and we have actually gotten to 1 o'clock after a very interesting conversation and a couple of great presentations. So I want to thank you both for your time. And also I'd like to thank our audience for all their great questions today. Really appreciate your input and contribution as well. And then please fill out the poll afterwards so that we know what direction we should head with our series of webinars in the fall. Thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.